We are very excited to present two of the smartest and most independent-minded people that we know who have very different views on the war that is currently taking place in Gaza regarding Israel and the like, but we knew that they would make for a great debate. They actually approached me and asked if I would host it, and I immediately said, of course I will. I think it's going to be fantastic. One of them is a longtime political consultant and activist, Omar Baddar. The other is Batya Ungar-Sargon, who has been on our show previously. She's the opinion editor at Newsweek. Omar is a supporter of the Palestinian side, Batya more so the Israeli side, and we are certain that this debate is going to shed a lot of light on every issue pertaining to this war. So good evening, Omar. Good evening, Batya. It's great to have you guys. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you so much for hosting this. It's so great to be here. Yeah, Omar and I were friends, and we were thinking, how could we elevate the discourse? Could we find a platform where we could, have a debate in a civil way about this really important issue? And of course, we thought of you, Glenn. So very excited to be here.
So glad you guys thought of me, and I'm going to do my best to facilitate this as much as possible. And I'm going to leave it mostly in your hands to kind of go back and forth and explore the issues you think should be most covered. So let me begin with you, Batya, just because you were on my show, I think maybe 3 weeks ago now, almost maybe a month. And one of the things we talked about was the number of Palestinians being killed in pursuit of the Israeli goal. So I think at the time, the count of people that had been killed were something like 6,000 Palestinians. The number is most definitely in excess of 15,000, closer to 16,000, at least several thousand of them children. Do you still feel comfortable? I know you don't want to see anybody dead or anything like that, but given that the war is entailing that, given what Gaza is, given how the Israelis are bombing, do you still feel comfortable with the progress Israel is making toward its goal? And what do you think that goal is?
It's a very, very important question. Of course, the death of any innocent, of any civilian, certainly of any child, but of anybody who's a non-combatant, is nothing short of a horror and a tragedy. I do think it is at this point unknowable to what extent we should be seeing in the numbers that tragedy, because I'm curious if you agree with me, Omar, but I don't feel that it is a tragedy when a Hamas militant is killed. And because the numbers that we have, the number of 15,000 certainly, is from Hamas's Gaza Ministry of Health, and they systematically do not distinguish between combatants and civilians, we don't know what proportion of these deaths are tragic and what proportion of them are part of Israel's military goal. So that would be the first point that I would make, is certainly there have been some civilian casualties, and certainly every single one of those is infinitely tragic. But to judge to what extent Israel has veered away from its military target, we have to know what proportion of those deaths are civilian. And that, so far, we don't know. We know that Israel estimates that it has killed 5,000 Hamas militants. We know that it has said around 10,000 civilians, but we don't yet know the answer to that. So I can't quite answer yet if I think that they have veered too far away. And I would say the other point that I would make about civilian casualties is that we know also that in terms of international law, there is this concept of proportionality, right? And when you're thinking about the proportion here, people often mistake the concept of proportionality to think about it in terms of proportion between the two sides. But it really is a way of addressing the proportion of the tragedy of the civilian cost to the military aim. And again, that is something that is simply unknowable until you know what that relation is. And we just don't have that information yet. But Omar, I'm really curious what you think about this. And I'm also curious if you agree with me that we cannot treat the death of Hamas militants as tragic. If you accept that that is sort of a moral statement, a moral way of looking at this situation.
Thank you, Batya.
Omar, before obviously want you to address that, but I just wanted to throw one point in that I'd also like you to address when addressing that. So Batya referred to proportionality. I'm wondering in your answer if you could explain as well, after the Hamas attack on October 7th, do you think Israel had any legal or moral right to use military force in Gaza, say against the perpetrators or against the Hamas leaders? So, I mean, in addressing that proportionality point, was there any justification, even if it wasn't wise, for Israel to use military force in response to October 7th?
There's a lot of points there, so I'll try to take a few of them.
Take your time. Go ahead.
In a row. On the question of the numbers, I think we've seen many previous Israeli assaults on Gaza, and the numbers coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry have been much, much closer to what independent organizations, including the UN and human rights organizations, have found. So there's every reason to believe that these numbers are reliable, just given the history that we've seen, and that Israeli numbers have actually been farther away from what independent organizations have found in previous rounds of the conflict. Now, I want to note the fact that the estimates right now is that 70% of those who are killed are women and children. And we are looking at a rate of killing children that is unprecedented in almost any conflict in recent memory. There's a reason why the head of the UN is describing Gaza as a graveyard for children. The estimate of about 7,000, just for reference, 7,000 children in Gaza in the course of 2 weeks, 2 months rather, compared to the entirety of Russia's campaign in Ukraine over the period of an entire year, killed fewer than 500 children. Obviously incredibly tragic. I don't want to minimize that. But just when you look at the rate of killing taking place in Gaza, it's more than 100 times worse than the rate of killing of children that took place in Ukraine. Unprecedented levels of killing journalists, unprecedented levels of killing medics. Looking at this, and quite frankly, it fits into what we're finding independently in terms of a investigation by 972, an Israeli publication that said that Israel's goal is partly to engage in a campaign of devastating the civilian population to create a shock that would put pressure on Hamas. We knew that they wanted to cut off water and electricity and food for all of the Gaza Strip, including its civilian population. We know that the Israeli president, Herzog, said that the civilian population in Gaza cannot be viewed as innocent. We know that Netanyahu invoked the Amalek from the Bible, referencing a quote about the killing of women and children and animals and completely obliterating your enemy. You add all of these things together, and frankly, it is difficult not to reach the conclusion that Israel is engaged in a campaign deliberately of devastating the civilian population of Gaza. You can't kill that many people by accident. You can't cause that level of destruction by accident. It's quite clear that looking at Israel's history, that what they engage in is campaigns in order to restore their so-called deterrence, to ensure that the civilian toll on the other side is absolutely astronomical, so that people are basically punished for having dared to engage in any violence on the Palestinian side. And what's important here, before we talk about October 7th, is to talk about October 6th, because the reality is this attack did not come out of nowhere. The reality for Palestinians is living in a besieged Gaza Strip in which there was unemployment was through the roof, in which there was no access to the outside world, no airport, no seaport, no economy to speak of, and no prospect for a better future for Palestinians living in Gaza, in addition to successive Israeli bombings of Gaza that killed literally thousands of people, including hundreds of children. So when you look at the situation, effectively what Israel is saying to the Palestinians, either you'll agree to live permanently as a population without rights, besieged, and without the prospect of freedom, or if you dare to fight back, we're going to inflict massive civilian casualties against you and make you regret ever fighting back. That, to me, is the fundamental problem in the question, in that if you look at October 7th in isolation, of course, anybody would respond to a crime of that magnitude with violence. But when you consider the fact that the starting point is Israeli occupation and an illegal siege over Gaza, you can't look at that event in isolation. And the goal should be, rather than vengeance or punishment, is to get to the root cause of why this violence exists. And the root cause is Israeli occupation and siege and apartheid. And until you dismantle that, you're not going to reach a point in which you can truly undermine support for violence, because Hamas grew by Israeli policies and actions. The reason why Hamas exists in the first place and why there is support for Palestinian militant activity is because of that desperation and despair created by Israel refusing to allow Palestinians to live in freedom as human beings with equal rights.
Go ahead, Batya.
I want to ask a question. I hope this doesn't sound like a callous question, but I think the question that I would have for you, Omar, is there what ratio of civilians to militants would you accept as evidence that Israel was trying to avoid civilian casualties? Is there a number that you would feel represented evidence? Because according to the Israeli numbers, it's 2-1. And again, like every civilian casualty is a total tragedy, a life lost. But in judging whether this is just war or whether this is a war crime, right? We have to know this question of how much is the tragedy relative to the military targets, which are legitimate. And so I wonder, is there a ratio that you would accept as proof that Israel was trying to avoid civilian casualties?
Can I just, Omar, before you answer, let me ask you about you, because right before the ceasefire, the numbers that were circulating, including from Israel, was that there were 30,000 militants in Gaza. They had killed 2,000 of them. And it does seem like right after the ceasefire, as there was a lot of controversy, the number from some sources kind of skyrocketed to 5,000. I'm just wondering what the source of those numbers are.
I read those numbers in the Times of Israel yesterday, but I want to make clear, I don't take what the IDF says at face value, right? I mean, they're a military. I think that I don't consider Israel to be the same or comparable to Hamas, but, they're obviously putting out their own version of propaganda, and that's something that I take into consideration. But I think that, so their number right now, the latest numbers from Times of Israel that I saw, which is usually pretty accurate, certainly in their quoting of the IDF, was 5,000 militants and 10,000 civilians. And I know that the number is more like 15,000 total from the Gaza Health Ministry, which includes both combatants and non-combatants.
Omar, go ahead.
If I can, if I can jump in on that. Look, I don't have a specific ratio in mind for what would convince me as a number, but I do take the word of human rights organizations that I think are much more experienced in that kind of thing. And so when human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, describe Israel's bombing as indiscriminate, they say it's causing too many civilian casualties, not enough effort is being put to avoid civilian casualties. And then you compare that with the fact that people like Netanyahu are saying that we want to thin out the population in Gaza. It all points in the direction of the numbers that are coming out of the IDF not being reliable. And again, of the fact that the civilian population in Gaza is effectively a target here. They're not coy when you're looking at the displacement of more than 1.5 million people inside of Gaza. It seems quite clear that there's an effort to commit ethnic cleansing. There are Israeli politicians who are floating the idea that we should push Palestinians out of Gaza and into the Sinai Desert. Just all of that put together, it's quite difficult for me to imagine that anybody can take the Israeli government's word seriously when they throw out numbers about trying to minimize the damage of policies that they have openly advocated for. They're just clearly speaking out of both sides of their mouths. And at the end of the day, to me, if human rights organizations are saying these bombings are indiscriminate and often target civilians, and you have investigations like the one by 972 magazine saying that internal sources within the Israeli military are describing a policy in which civilians are targeted to create a shock and to destroy civil society, we can take that at face value and take that as being a lot more credible than the Israeli government's word trying to do PR damage control.
But if the Israeli government was trying to thin out the population, why would they have displaced them? I mean, wouldn't it have been better to leave them in Gaza City and just why would they have opened up those humanitarian corridors? I mean, doesn't the act of displacing them mean that that an effort was put into keeping them from being targets?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. Look, I think ultimately there is a limit to the number to which Israel is going to kill Palestinians while the world remains silent. Sadly, I think it's going to be a much higher number than all of us had hoped it would be. But I think the preference is to push them outside of the Gaza Strip. They're talking about a buffer zone. They're talking about many, many different ideas. Frankly, I don't think that the Israeli government has a very coherent plan for Gaza. It's a lot of different ideas. And one of them, clearly what they want to do is to push the population south. There was a plan published early on by some agency within the Israeli government talking about what pushing Palestinians into the Sinai Desert would look like. And phase one of that was pushing all Palestinians south from the north of Gaza. And that was effectively what they did, while bombing in the south as well, while designating certain areas as safe havens, but bombing those areas anyway. And, leafleting and telling people to take certain paths out, and those paths end up getting targeted. Altogether, I think what Israel is doing is creating a situation in which life in Gaza feels unsafe, where people are desperate to leave, where there might not be a place for Palestinians to go back to because the extent of the destruction is so extensive that Gaza just stops being able to support life. And you end up applying very significant pressure on Egypt to open that border in order to allow Palestinians to survive. That's my speculation on what Israel has in mind now, with a caveat that I don't think that they have a super thought out plan, apart from just exacting vengeance in the meantime while they try to figure out the specifics and what the world will tolerate.
Batya, let me just add. Can I just ask you, because that was part of my first question too, is like this idea of the proportionality, which you defined as whatever the amount of death is necessary to accomplish the valid goal. What do you really believe the goal is? The stated goal of Israel at the beginning, and I guess currently still, is to destroy Hamas. And they were very clear. We don't mean erode it. We don't mean weaken it. We mean destroy it. So what would that look like? And then do you give any credence to this alternative motive or plan, which has leaked in military documents and been expressed by members of the Israeli government, that they believe that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank belong to them, and their real ultimate goal is to make it uninhabitable for Gazans, so they have to leave?
Obviously, there's far-right people who say those things and believe those things, and so I don't deny that, but I don't think that represents the kind of the goal, the aim, or the mainstream, as far as I can tell. I don't want to gaslight, like those things were said, obviously, but I think that overall, it's pretty clear that the aim here is to completely eradicate Hamas. And in fact, my first thought was they need to get the innocent civilians of Gaza out of the way while they do this, and then bring them back. I mean, my first thought was, how do we protect these civilians from what is going to now be an extremely, extremely aggressive, punishing, and I think just aim, which is to eliminate this terrorist force. And I think what I wanted to ask you, Omar, was, is there a way that Israel could have gone about eliminating Hamas that you would have thought was both just and justified, and something that you would have supported?
Yeah, Batya, I think before getting to the tactical aspect of this, it is really a question of underlying cause and motivation. If there is a world, because we have to understand where Hamas came from and what destroying Hamas actually means. And frankly, I think the trajectory that we're on now, even if Israel miraculously was able to eliminate every last Hamas member by the end of this, I think you're setting yourself up to a situation where the extent of the killing and the damage and the despair and the anger that is created by this campaign is simply going to produce the next generation of militants. This is how we got here in the first place. And so, again, I just go back to this idea of, if one attack by Hamas that is unquestionably horrendous, I mean, look, had it been constrained to Israeli military targets, there would have been an argument to say that this is a legitimate act of resistance. But obviously, because it ended up killing so many Israeli civilians as well, that makes it an indefensible attack at the end of the day that nobody should defend. But if we're saying that's enough to say that Israel gets to do whatever it wants to destroy Hamas, why isn't the opposite argument also standard? That if you're looking at the actions of the Israeli government, if you look at the death toll that the Israeli government has imposed on the civilian population in Gaza and in the West Bank, and the extremely lengthy history of land theft and massacres and destruction of homes, does that justify Palestinians having the aim of destroying the Israeli government? And does that also entail a campaign of how many Israeli civilian casualties would be tolerable? We never ask that question in reverse. And I think part of the problem here is that we are conditioned to think of the Israeli government as a legitimate government, as somehow being the protagonist in the story, and to think of Hamas as the evil terrorist organization. And it's that dichotomy that I fundamentally reject. I think the underlying problem that we have, and there have been people who've used many examples to me, another obvious one is in apartheid in South Africa, when, obviously black people in South Africa were oppressed, were confined to small areas, were experiencing unspeakable oppression and violence on a daily basis. And there were groups like the ANC that were setting off bombs and killing innocent white civilians in South Africa. And the question is, how do you solve this? And to me, the obvious answer is you solve it by ending apartheid in South Africa, which was the only way that we reached a point in which we dealt with the underlying cause. And this is a very similar situation in that the reason why we are here is because Israel keeps insisting on trying to pummel Palestinians into submission, to accept being a people that is without rights, that does not have the ability to move around on its land. In the case of Gaza, even more constrained in terms of having no economy, no clean water, and not being able to go in and out. All of this is a structural relationship of dominance, which is the reason why people get so desperate and so angry that they join Hamas in the first place. So I just don't think that we're on a trajectory by saying that Israel is justified in pursuing this end. Israel has every right to want a better future for Israelis and a safer future for Israelis. And the way we get there is not by insisting on pummeling Palestinians into submission. The way we get there is by fundamentally changing the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, where Palestinians are seen as equals who can actually enjoy the same rights that Israelis enjoy. And that's really going to be ultimately the only path forward in which we do get the safety for all Israelis and all Palestinians that I'm pretty certain that both you and I would like to see.
Batya, let me just throw in a question there based on what Omar just said, and it actually goes back a little bit to the goal, because this is the thing I'm struggling with so much, is this idea that we're going to destroy Hamas, that Israel is going to destroy Hamas, because it does remind me a lot of the war on terror, where the idea was we're going to go and destroy terrorism. And what we found was that the more we bombed, in many ways, the more terrorism that got created. There were so many attempted terrorist attack or terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, where the people who did it said, my motive is I've been watching innocent people being killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and all these wedding parties you're bombing and these children you're killing. And it just created this enormous amount of anti-American rage that was even larger than what preceded 9/11. When you think about this war that you say is just, like, what are you envisioning about how Israel's going to put the Palestinian people through what they're putting them through, not just in Gaza, by the way, but also in the West Bank, and then at the end of it, there's going to somehow be peace? Why would there ever be peace when you've subjected a population to this level of killing and destruction?
Well, I think there's a lot of examples in history of, extremely violent conflicts that ended in peace when both sides were sick of losing their loved ones. I want to briefly respond to something that Omar said, which is, if Hamas had decided to take Beersheba and had attacked military outposts, and in the midst of this act of war had killed civilians, I would probably, I hope that I would be responding to that in a very similar way as I am to Israel's to Israel's military operation in Gaza right now. I think that's a very legitimate point, and I'm glad that you said that if Hamas had only attacked military targets, right, and had, even in the midst of attacking those military targets, had killed civilians, it would still be a tragedy for the people of Israel. I would probably have people that I would be mourning personally, but it would be of a different order of magnitude than what Hamas actually did. And I think it is really important to point that out. I think probably a lot of people on my side would be angry at me for saying that, but I do think that's a really important point. Glenn, to your point, First of all, I think Omar and I are probably very much in agreement about the West Bank, but also when you talk to people there, you both have, it is amazing that that coexist within them both extreme anger at what they've been put through and what they are continuing to be put through, and extreme hope and desire for a peaceful solution to this conflict. I don't accept that people are fundamentally different, and they have to share the land. I don't know why I'm saying we, I'm American, but they have to share the land, and there has to be a peaceful resolution. And there have been conflicts that have been brutal, much more brutal than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that turned on a dime. And it is always amazing to me how little Palestinians that I meet want revenge, how little they want to hold on to this rage, and how much they just want a just resolution. And I think that, so to me, I really don't see this argument of that there's no coming back from this. Every mother wants the same thing for her children. Like, every person wants the same thing for their babies. And so I think that, I don't see why this couldn't turn on a dime. This might sound totally naive, but I have a feeling that, the Israelis are going to wake up from this. Like, if the second intifada, somebody said this the other day, and I thought this was really true. If the second intifada murdered the Israeli left, I think October 7th murdered the Israeli right, for all the reasons you guys are bringing up. I mean, nobody strengthened Hamas and built up Hamas like Benjamin Netanyahu, who has made a career of humiliating Abu Mazen and strengthening Hamas because he thought that this status quo was sustainable. It's not. We know it's not. And I just think that I just feel so much more hopeful about that, which is possibly totally naive.
Omar, let me ask you, just because Batya referred to these historical examples where this did happen, where some sort of peace or coexistence emerged in the wake of horrific force. And the examples that are typically used are, the United States and Great Britain and other powers, firebombed German cities, deliberately killing an enormous amount of German civilians. And at the end of the war, the Germans didn't say, I'm going to dedicate my life to killing Americans. The Germans became, kind of a peaceful country. They demilitarized. Same with Japan, on which we dropped 2 nuclear weapons. So why don't those models hold promise here, that at the end of the war, the Palestinians will realize that their only path to peace is to sort of be de-radicalized or something?
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference between those examples is that we have, as the underlying policy of the Israeli government, is to continue confining Palestinians in Gaza and to continue essentially what can only be described as a campaign of land theft and slow motion ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, where every day there are more Palestinian homes being demolished, there are more illegal Israeli settlements being built in the West Bank, and where people in East Jerusalem are pushed out of their homes and Israeli settlers come and take over those homes. Because that's an underlying reality, it is very difficult to imagine a situation in which what emerges at the end of this is a better future. We have a tilted dynamic of a relationship of dominance between Israel and the Palestinians, in which the goal is not right now from the Israeli government and frankly from the entire Israeli political climate, one in which we're looking for a future in which we're all living either in an equitable two-state solution where Palestinians have a real viable state that, can exist on par with an Israeli state, or a situation in which we all live in one state with everybody having equal rights. Neither of these possibilities is anywhere remotely close to what the Israeli political climate currently supports. And therefore, the underlying reality here is that this is a situation of dominance where Palestinians are going to be denied freedom for the foreseeable future, and where world powers like the United States policy is simply to enable and support whatever Israel wants to do. There's rhetorical objections. You'll hear Biden saying Israel should do more to protect civilians, or we support a Palestinian state. But those are simply slogans that are accompanied with unrelenting U.S. military funding for Israel that is completely unconditional, and diplomatic support that is also unconditional, where the U.S. keeps intervening at the United Nations to veto resolutions that are trying to hold Israel accountable for violations of international law. The number of vetoes is over 50, which is greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all the other permanent members of the Security Council combined on all issues from the 1970s until today, and where every method of Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation is demonized If it's boycotts, they're called economic terrorism. And we pass laws in the US that undermine the First Amendment in order to make it more difficult for Americans to boycott Israel or Israeli illegal settlements, where Palestinians marching to the fence unarmed in Gaza back in 2018, the Israeli military responded by opening fire on them, sniper fire, killing journalists and medics. All of this stuff is documented by human rights organizations, and all of it led to complete world disregard for Palestinians' calls for freedom. And the only time the world pays attention is when Palestinians act with violence, which I think is very much feeding the wrong lesson, that if we want to pull Palestinians away from supporting organizations like Hamas or from seeing that as a path forward, we have to create hope in which Palestinians can, through peaceful means, have a prospect for freedom. And that has to entail meaningful and real pressure on Israel to behave the way it interacts with Palestinians. And that's what we have not seen from Washington. And in a way, I think the United States government is absolutely complicit in getting us stuck in a dynamic in which Israel gets away with whatever it wants. Palestinians have no prospect for a better future. And that creates a situation that is ripe for violence. And that's why we are where we are.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.